So when you hear the name Moses, how many of you think of this? By show of hands. It's okay if you don't. There's not a wrong answer. For those of you that are joining us at home, type in the chat if any of these images trigger for you. This is Rembrandt's famous painting of Moses holding the Ten Commandments. And even if you don't think of this specific painting, maybe that image when you hear Moses of the Ten Commandments holding the tablets of stone, maybe that's what comes to mind. Or maybe when you hear the name Moses, how many of you think of this? I knew I'd get quite a few folks with that one. Cecil B. DeMille's famous Ten Commandments. I don't know why they decided to show this at Easter every year when I was a kid, but they did. And the movie is like 8,000 hours long, so they broke it up over several nights. And we gathered around the TV when I was a kid, and we watched the 2 or 3 hour program every single evening, every year, as we gathered together. And how many of you, when you hear the name Moses, think of something like this? That's about what I expected. A singular shepherd in the field by themselves tending sheep. Now, each and every one of these images are accurate. They reflect who we know Moses to be. Moses is often thought of as a pillar of our faith, author of several books of scripture, and a champion for God. And each and every one of those attributes are true. But he didn't start out that way. And I'm sure if you ask the people that actually knew Moses before his encounter with Pharaoh, if you told them what you know of Moses, this great champion and hero of our faith, they might look at you just a little bit weird. Let me tell you what I mean. How many of you have heard of the book Alice in Wonderland? Did you know there's a sequel? It's called Through the Looking Glass. Still written by Lewis Carroll, published in 1871, and it continues Alice's adventures in this whimsical place. Now, one of the things that intrigue people so much about these stories is the space that it gives for imagination, for the impossible. It's a whimsical land, and people love just to spend time imagining what is possible and what could be. Now, in this sequel, Through the Looking Glass, there's an exchange between Alice and the White Queen. See, the White Queen's shawl has blown off her shoulders and blown towards Alice. Alice catches it and seeks to return it to the Queen, and in that interaction, they have quite the conversation. Alice learns that in this land, memory works backwards. And so Alice is very perplexed at how you can remember something that hasn't happened yet. And so she starts to get all worked up. And so the Queen seeks to calm her down and says, Alice, think of something that you know to be certain. And so the Queen offers up a for instance. She says, for instance, I am 101 years, 5 months, and 1 day old. Alice laughs at her, says, there's no way that could be true. And one cannot believe in impossible things. Well, the Queen immediately responds and say, well, I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. And I got to thinking about those two people. Alice, who thinks it is not wise to believe in the impossible. Things that you can't see, touch, taste, smell, or hear. Those tangible things. And then you have the Queen, who sometimes believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. And I got to thinking about our faith. How often, how many of us live life at the end of the spectrum of only what we can touch, what we can see, what we believe, what can be possible? And how often do we get to live at the other end of living in the impossible, in the things that can only happen because of God and God's work in this world and through us? Our Old Testament character for today, Moses, he operated on all ends of that spectrum. Now, Moses' life, if you go back and read through parts of the Old Testament, his life begins in a very uncertain way. You see, he's born into a family of Israelites. And in this era, the Israelites have grown in Egypt to be so numerous that Pharaoh becomes concerned. You see, they far outnumber he and the Egyptians, and he's concerned that these Israelites might overthrow him, might overtake him just out of their sheer number. And so Pharaoh decrees that all of the Israelites are to be enslaved. Moses is born to one of these enslaved families. And about the time that Moses is born, Pharaoh puts out a decree that all male Hebrew babies are to be killed. Now, all of you know that brand new babies are just the quietest things in the world, right? Moses' mother and father know that they are not going to be able to keep him a secret. And so out of their great love for him, we know the story of where they place him in the basket and they waterproof it with tar and they send him down the river. We know that Pharaoh's daughter discovers him in this basket among the bulrushes, has pity upon this child, and adopts him as her own. So we now have adopted Moses growing up in the palace of the Pharaoh with all of the perks and wonders that go along with that, on top of the world, so to speak. We also know that at about 40 years of age, Moses is walking through the palace and he sees a guard mistreating one of the Israelites. Moses takes offense to that, challenges the guard, and ends up killing him. Fearing that Pharaoh will, in turn, kill Moses, Moses runs. He flees. He runs out into the wilderness of Midian. We know it's there that he finds his wife Zipporah, that he is adopted again into the family of Jethro, and that he begins his life as a shepherd. That occupation that many scholars believe was viewed as the lowest of the low. Nobody wanted to be a shepherd. But here we have Moses fleeing, scared, running for his life, not wanting to be known or recognized, just wants to be alone in the field in the no-pressure job of being a sheep. Well, one day Moses is out tending the sheep, and we've heard the story of the burning bush. This bush that catches fire but is not consumed. This bush that when Moses approaches, he hears the voice of the Lord, "Remove your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground." Moses complies, removes his shoes. He bows in reverence before God. And that's where God tells Moses, "You are going to go to Pharaoh and have my people released." Now, at this point, you might think, wow, what an honor. Absolutely, I'll go and I'll take care of that for you. If we read through Moses' story, that's not what Moses does. The excuse train pulls into the station, and Moses begins to offer one right after another reasons about why that is too impossible for someone like Moses to be able to do. He begins by saying that he feels he is certainly not the person for this calling, that he is unworthy. He says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" Remember, at this point, Moses is 80 years old. He's a desert shepherd and on the run from Pharaoh's punishment. But God answers this excuse and tells Moses, "I will be with you." Moses, not being satisfied, next course was to plead ignorance. He said, "If I go and tell them that you sent me, I don't even know your name. Who do I tell people has sent me to release them?" And so God supplies the answer for that. And he says, "I am who I am. Tell them that I am has sent you, that I am the God of their ancestors, of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob." Moses again had another excuse. He didn't have authority over the Israelites. He says, "Lord, who do you think I am? I don't have any credibility with the Hebrews. If I go and I announce that I am their deliverer, they won't believe me. They won't listen to me. They will think I'm lying about what you have said." And God answered this excuse by enabling Moses to perform signs and wonders to prove that he had authority from God. Two examples we read about are Moses' staff being turned into a snake and back into a staff, and a point where Moses takes his clean hand, sticks it in his cloak, pulls it out, and it's leprous, puts it back in, pulls it out again, and it's clean. Still, after all of this, Moses is not convinced, and he offers up another excuse, one that he thinks might stop God, a personal excuse. He says he's unable to go and speak for God because he was slow of speech and tongue. God answered Moses with this one by reminding him that God had created his mouth and that he would teach his mouth what to say. Now, at this point, Moses has made several excuses. God has had an answer for each and every one of them, but Moses is just desperate. He really, really does not want to go. And in Exodus 4:13, he just cuts through all of the excuses and just says, send anybody but me. Anybody else can go. Send anybody but me. God tells Moses that he would receive help, that God would send his brother Aaron, who is already on his way, to meet him, and that God would work through the two of them to release the Israelites from Pharaoh. Finally, Moses, out of excuses, says yes. And he started off in faith to obey God. And as we know, because we know the end of the story, we can read it in Scripture, God was faithful. God did amazing and miraculous things through this servant. Not only did he free the Israelites, but we read about the plagues that happened in Egypt. We read about God parting the Red Sea so that the Israelites could cross through. We read about God leading them by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. We read about Moses leading them for 40 years into the promised land that has been given to them by God. Just amazing and incredible things that happen on this journey. And God continued to be with Moses throughout all of it, to make him the leader that he needed to be to lead the Israelites into the promised land. So up to this point, looking at Moses, the image and the picture that I have painted this morning, would we call him a hero of our faith? Maybe reluctant hero would come to mind. Certainly not someone that jumped right at the first opportunity and said, oh, send me, here I am, I will go and be your mouthpiece. But someone that God had to push along, to coax along, someone that God had to work with. You know, we don't call Moses a hero because of how he behaved in the beginning. We call Moses a hero because of how he behaved at the end, because of his faithfulness, because of his willingness to say yes. Moses tried every excuse in the book to say no to God, but God persisted. Moses doubted that he could be used in such a dramatic way, but God knew better. Moses doubted that he was capable of what God was asking him to do, and he was not enough for God. But God knew what God could do through him. When Moses finally agreed to go and allow God to work through him, we see a change. We see a change in Moses because Moses' relationship with God grew deeper. Moses, over the course of that last part of his life, has many, many conversations with God. Moses is one of the few people in Scripture that was recorded as having a physical encounter with God. Encounters that leave his face radiant, shining so bright that he eventually begins to wear a veil when he approaches the Israelites. God was very real and a very present aspect of Moses' later adult life. And these numerous conversations that are recorded for us show us that Moses developed a deep and abiding relationship with his Creator. One where his life became focused on God and God's purpose for him. Now, Moses' confidence, not his pride or his ego, but his confidence in God's faithfulness grows as well. Moses was charged with leading his people, the Israelites, out of Egypt and into the promised land. The journey was going to require leading many people through a land they were unfamiliar with, on a trek that was hastily prepared for, with provisions that were nowhere near adequate. But that was what would have happened had it been solely on our terms. But God showed up time and time again to provide for these people all that they would need. Moses, consistently affirmed by God, left his life as a shepherd, followed God, and through God's hand led his people. But you see, the key to how we understand and view Moses and how we understand and view ourselves comes not just in what Moses did, but in Moses' obedience. Initially, Moses was not obedient to God, offering excuse after excuse. But when Moses finally allowed faith to be his guide, God continually and faithfully worked through him and in him, pushing him, using him, transforming him. As the story of Moses goes on, we see him change, and from this reluctant shepherd, from this scared person, we see a bold servant emerge for God. A servant that held his people accountable, a servant that eventually becomes God's mouthpiece for the law that was given to them. He even was the Israelites' advocate when God said he was going to destroy them. And as Moses' life progressed, that obedience strengthened. Moses gave everything up that he knew to follow God. His life in Midian, his no-pressure job as a shepherd, the security of being a member of Jethro's family. And he gave it all up based on a promise from God. Looking at that, I would consider him very obedient. Moses was a man that went through incredible changes over the span of his lifetime. He went from a fearful, calculating person to one that accomplished the incredible, the unbelievable, and by human standards, the impossible. But this transformation was not easy for Moses, nor was it one that could have happened without God. It happened because Moses eventually succumbed to God's will and allowed God to work in him and through him. He gave up his own passions and desires, understanding that God's will for his life was better. He learned that his small picture view of himself and of his life was an inadequate one, that God had a much better image in his mind. Remember the White Queen's quote from the book Through the Looking Glass, why sometimes I thought of as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast? That's my challenge for all of us this week with a little bit of a twist. I would like you to spend time this week and think of 6 impossible things that God can do through you. What is something you've been putting aside? What is something you have been pushing off? What is something you've been kind of looking the other direction, hoping God would forget about? What is that little nudge that God has given you? That thing that he wants you to do, those words that he wants you to say that you're like, God, I love you, but that's too much for me. Where have you put yourself in a box and belittled yourself and made yourself smaller than what God sees, what God created? Moses didn't turn himself over to God overnight. It took him a long time after he was 80 years old to succumb to the will of God in his life. So that's my challenge. Spend time this week with your Creator, with your Father in heaven. Allow yourself to see yourself as God sees you. Open yourself up to the wonder that God has when he looks at you. Allow yourself to feel that smile that goes across God's face every time he looks at you. Think as much of yourself as God thinks of you. And then ask God, what is the 6 impossible things that you and I can do together?